It was supposed to be a routine zoning appeal, nothing controversial. Just another Tuesday morning inside courtroom 4C of the Briar County Courthouse. But when Emmett Rowe stepped up to the podium, something shifted. He didn't look like the others who had spoken before him. Tall, sun-tanned, wearing a weathered denim jacket over a plaid shirt, Emmett's hands were calloused from decades of work, and the boots on his feet still carried flecks of morning mud. His posture was respectful, but firm. He wasn't there to make noise, he was there to speak truth. Behind him sat a dozen neighbours, mostly elderly farmers and small-town business owners, all watching quietly, all with folded hands and furrowed brows. The judge leaned forward. Judge Clarissa Hightower, 49, known for her polished demeanour and zero-nonsense court. Ivy League educated, unbothered by emotion. She peered down at Emmett through her designer glasses and asked crisply, "Mr. Rowe, you're here representing Rowe Farms and several co-signers in opposition to the corporate development project, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Emmett replied, voice low and steady. His southern accent was thick, not cartoonish but authentic. Every vowel had a story. "We're just asking for the land to stay what it's always been." Clarissa raised an eyebrow and smirked faintly. Then it happened. She turned to the court recorder and said, audibly enough for everyone to hear, "Could we get a translator on standby? I'd like to understand at least half of what this man's saying." Laughter from the prosecution bench, a couple muffled chuckles from the gallery, but Emmett didn't laugh. He didn't flinch. He just blinked once. Slow. Then tilted his head slightly, like a bull sizing up a fence before breaking through it. The room was quiet again. And then Emmett leaned into the mic. The next 30 seconds would flip the entire courtroom and the judge's smirk on its head. Emmett Rowe looked up at Judge Clarissa Hightower, his eyes calm but piercing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence for a moment said more than 100 objections ever could. "Your Honour," he said slowly, "I might not speak the way you're used to, but I reckon truth don't change based on how it's pronounced." The smirk vanished from the judge's face. The courtroom shifted. "I grew up in Briar County," Emmett continued, "on the same patch of dirt my granddaddy worked and his daddy before him. We didn't have much, but we had hands, and we had honesty. My accent?" He paused. "It comes from sitting beside my mama on a porch swing while she read scripture in the dark, from digging fence posts before sunrise, from burying my daddy in boots he never once took off for a man's opinion." The judge tried to interject, but Emmett didn't stop. The room was his now. "You laughed at the way I talk," he said, voice still quiet, still polite. "But this voice paid off 4 mortgages. It helped neighbours rebuild after tornadoes. It fed 3 counties last winter when supply chains failed. This voice, Your Honour, ain't broken. But the system that makes a courtroom mock the people it's meant to serve, that might be." Gasps from the gallery. Even the court reporter paused typing. Emmett leaned on the podium with both hands. "Now, I may not know Latin phrases or how to wear a tie without feeling strangled, but I do know how to plant a seed, tend it with care, and bring something honest out of the ground. I know how to make something grow where nothing was." He looked directly at the judge now. "And right now, I'm asking you to stop letting folks like me be paved over like we don't matter. 'Cause we do, even if we say it's slow." No one moved. No one breathed. The moment wasn't loud, but it thundered just the same. The judge slowly sat back. Her fingers were still. Because Emmett hadn't just answered her joke, he'd handed her a mirror, and everyone saw who was on the other side of it. The silence in courtroom 4C had a different weight now, one filled with realization, not judgment. It wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence people give when they realize they've just witnessed something real. The court reporter, a woman who had transcribed thousands of cases, quietly reached for a tissue. She wasn't the only one. Judge Hightower shifted uneasily in her chair. Her confidence hadn't vanished, but something had cracked. The smugness, the subtle superiority, the urban veneer, it all felt exposed under Emmett Rowe's plain-spoken truth. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Rowe, you're obviously very passionate, but this hearing is about zoning, not philosophy." Emmett gave a single nod. "Yes, ma'am. Then let's talk facts." He reached down and pulled out a manila folder, tattered and hand-labelled, not like the glossy binders the corporate lawyers had wheeled in earlier. But inside, receipts, crop yield charts. Groundwater testing reports, emails, photos of kids with vegetables grown from his land, letters from neighbouring farms, evidence of a living, breathing community that depended on that soil. He opened the folder, hands steady. These here show how Rowe Farms provides over 70% of the local school district's produce. That's free lunch programs, summer pantries. Those numbers you see? That's not theory. That's kids eating when the shelves run empty. A rustle moved through the gallery as more neighbours leaned forward, recognising the names on the documents. Some clutched their hats. Others wiped their eyes. Emmett continued. You greenlight that developer and it ain't just concrete going over dirt. You'll be covering the only waterline left clean in this part of the county. These reports, he tapped the stack, come from your own environmental office. I know the lingo ain't fancy, but the data don't care how I say it. One of the corporate lawyers whispered something into the other's ear, his face paling slightly. Judge Hightower looked down at the reports, now visibly rattled. Where did you get all this? Emmett looked her dead in the eye. From the land, from the people, from listening, something I recommend this court try sometime. There was no applause, not yet, but there was something more powerful. Respect. The courtroom that once chuckled at a farmer's drawl was now hanging on every word that drawl delivered. Judge Hightower shuffled the documents in front of her, trying to reclaim control. But every rustle of paper sounded like a concession. The power in the room had shifted, and not because of volume, but because of truth. She cleared her throat again. Mr. Rowe, while I appreciate your local perspective, this court must weigh economic impact on a broader scale. That's when Emmett gently leaned back and said, Funny thing, Your Honour. You saying that's the bigger picture, but there's more folks in this room than there were behind your closed-door developer meetings. A murmur rippled through the crowd. He wasn't wrong. We all stayed quiet too long, Emmett said, turning slightly toward the gallery. We thought letters and petitions were enough. We thought maybe, just maybe, the court would listen without us having to parade into town dressed like protesters. He glanced down at his boots. But I guess mud don't travel as well as money. That one line, it struck a chord. The woman seated behind Emmett, Margie Winslow, 72, former teacher and lifelong resident, stood up without being asked. Your Honour, she said in a trembling voice, I watched that man bring food to my front porch when my son was laid up in the hospital. Not for money, not for thanks. Just 'cause that's what neighbours do. If the court don't see value in that, maybe we're looking at the wrong kind of development. Another man stood. Benjo Hill, 55, farm equipment mechanic. You think this land's empty? It's been raising families for 100 years. That accent you laughed at, that's the sound of the people who built this town. Then came another, and another. One by one, residents began to rise, not to shout or disrupt, but simply to stand. Not in protest, in presence. It wasn't dramatic, it was solemn. The kind of thing you'd find in a chapel before a funeral or a wedding. The sacred moment when people remember who they are. Even the corporate lawyers looked rattled now. The lead developer whispered to his assistant, Why didn't we anticipate this? Back at the bench, Judge Hightower gripped the arm of her chair. Not out of anger, out of realization. She hadn't just underestimated Emmett Rowe's words. She'd underestimated his roots, and the people who shared them were finally done staying quiet. Judge Clarissa Hightower stared out at the gallery, now full of standing citizens, not shouting, not rioting, just watching, waiting for her to say something that wouldn't insult them again. Her gavel sat untouched. Emmett Rowe took one small step back from the microphone and stood tall, thumbs hooked into his belt. He didn't puff his chest. He didn't have to, because the weight in the room wasn't about ego, it was about presence. Your Honour, he said evenly, if you still think my accent's a punchline, I got nothing else to say. But if you've been listening, then you know this ain't about how I talk. It's about who's been talking and who's finally been heard. Hightower swallowed. The legal clerk leaned in to whisper something, but she waved him off. This is highly irregular, she muttered, more to herself than to the court. We're supposed to deal in codes, not sentiment. And from the gallery, Margie Winslow called out, gently but boldly, Then maybe it's time the code started making room for the people it's supposed to protect. A few heads nodded and a few others, eyes now filled with something the court hadn't seen in years. Hope. Emmett leaned forward again. "Judge, I respect your chair, but respect ain't one way. You sit up there carrying the law, fine. We carry this town. On our backs, on our tractors, through floods and dry seasons. We don't have million-dollar lobbyists. We got torn hands, tired bones, and one last chance to ask this system to look us in the eye." He paused. "And today we're doing that." At that moment, a young woman in the gallery, Ashley Bloom, 28 EMT, and granddaughter of a farmer, stood and held up her phone. "Ma'am," she said clearly, "you're live. Over 40,000 people are watching this stream. You may not like how Emmett sounds, but America sure does." The courtroom buzzed. The prosecution team, stone-faced moments ago, began to fidget in their seats. The developer's attorney turned ghost white. The narrative had left the courtroom and gone national. Judge Hightower tapped her finger nervously on the bench. Her voice came smaller now. "This is out of procedure." Emmett didn't miss a beat. "Maybe your procedure needs to catch up to your people." She looked down. She didn't reach for the gavel, because even she knew, today it wouldn't sound like order. It would sound like regret. Judge Hightower looked down at the bench, at her notes, the printed development plans, the tidy paperwork that once felt so official. But now? Paper couldn't hold back the wave rising in that courtroom, and Emmett Rowe hadn't even finished. He stepped forward once more, boots echoing against the tile floor, each step as steady as a clock. He placed one worn photo on the evidence table. No fanfare. No speech. It was a black and white photo. His great-grandfather standing in front of the same field they were now trying to rezone. Shirtless, grinning, hands covered in dirt. Behind him, 2 mules and the first harvested crop of 1924. "This here," Emmett said softly, "ain't just land. It's legacy." He looked at Judge Hightower. "You ever dig your hands in soil and know you were touching where your bloodline began?" She didn't answer. "This court may be used to rows of suits and polished words," he continued, "but the people who built this county never needed polish. We needed weatherproof boots, strong backs, and faith that if we broke ground honest, someone in a courtroom wouldn't come along 100 years later and sell our roots to the highest bidder." He paused, then looked straight at the bench. "And let me say this plain, Your Honor. You may outrank me in this courtroom, but not in credibility. Not when the folks who know this land are standing behind me and the ones standing behind you are holding dollar signs." The room was thunderously silent. That was the line, the one that lit a fire in the room. The one that spread faster than any legal memo ever could. In the back, someone whispered, "That needs to be on a T-shirt." The gallery murmured again, this time with reverence. A tweet went out, "Farmer just told a judge she may have the robe, but not the credibility. I'm shaking, Briar County. Respect the roots." Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, dozens more had gathered. They held signs not with slogans, but names, family names tied to the very soil under debate. And inside, for the first time that day, Judge Hightower looked unsure. She leaned forward, hands clasped, and asked quietly, "Mr. Rowe, if this land were preserved, what would you do with it?" He didn't hesitate. "Same thing we've always done," he said. "Feed people, raise families, and remind this country what honest work really sounds like." For the first time in the entire hearing, Judge Hightower didn't speak. She just stared, at Emmett, at the people behind him, at the old photograph on the table. Her gavel remained untouched. Her posture shifted. She didn't look defeated. She looked humbled. Emmett stepped back from the podium and nodded respectfully. "I've said what I came to say. It's in your hands now, Your Honor. Just remember, some of us don't get second chances to protect what matters." He turned to sit, and just before he did, something remarkable happened. Every person in the gallery stood up, not with signs, not with slogans, just presence. Farmers, teachers, factory workers, truckers, a few students, some elderly folks who could barely stand but rose anyway. It wasn't a protest. It was a witnessing. Judge Hightower's eyes swept the room. She saw Margie Winslow standing with tears in her eyes, hand over her heart. She saw Benjo Hill, jaw clenched, arms folded across his chest like a wall of honor. She saw Ashley Bloom, still holding her phone, the live stream count now pushing 600,000 views. Even the developer's lawyer, slick-haired and suited, looked shaken. Then Judge Hightower did something she hadn't done in 17 years on the bench. She stood, not in judgment, in response. "I owe this court," she said slowly, "and especially Mr. Rowe, an apology. My words earlier were inappropriate, disrespectful, and shamefully dismissive of voices that matter." The courtroom went still again. I've spent my career learning the law, but today I was reminded what justice sounds like, and sometimes it has a southern accent. A low, emotional chuckle passed through the gallery. "I will be reviewing all developer records submitted to this court. I will be reopening the environmental reports, especially the ones flagged in Mr. Rowe's evidence. And until this court has completed a full review, this land is protected. No permits, no construction." Gasps. Then a single clap. Then another. Then the whole courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in honest applause. Not for a ruling, for a man who had reminded the law where its roots were. Outside, the news had already broken. Judge laughs at farmer's accent, but 30 seconds later, she's the one taking notes. Zoning reversal in Bryan County goes viral. Over 1 million-watch live stream of farmer's courtroom speech. He spoke soft, but he spoke for all of us. By morning, the world had changed. Emmett Rowe's testimony wasn't just a local story anymore. It had gone global. The clip of him speaking slowly, calmly, and with unwavering dignity had racked up 2.3 million views overnight. And the quote, "You may outrank me in this courtroom, but not in credibility," was now printed across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and even etched onto handmade signs outside the courthouse. Headlines filled every feed. Farmer shames judge who mocked him. Now everyone's listening. Accent becomes anthem. Small-town man silences big city power. Legacy versus law, and legacy wins. Across the country, farmers posted videos of their own, sharing the accents they once felt ashamed of. Veterans, truckers, teachers, all of them saying the same thing. "We talk like him, and today we stand with him." At a university in Michigan, a linguistics professor played Emmett's speech in class. She told her students, "This is what authenticity sounds like, and authenticity doesn't need permission to speak." Back in Bryan County, Judge Hightower had just returned to her chambers. Her assistant entered with a stack of letters, emails printed out, handwritten notes from residents, even one from a federal district judge. She picked up the first one. "You reminded us that justice doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it rises from the ground up, same as good crops." Across town, Emmett Rowe sat at his kitchen table. Same boots, same hat, a pot of coffee half full. He wasn't watching the news. He wasn't reading comments. He was reviewing the seed order for next season. His wife, Jenna, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know the county wants you to speak at the next commissioners' meeting?" He chuckled. "Do they know I still talk the same way?" "They don't want you to change, Emmett. They want to remember how not to." Outside, a truck passed by and honked twice. The driver held up a sign out the window. "You spoke for all of us." And in the town square, someone had already started painting a mural on the side of the feed store. Emmett, standing in the courtroom, finger pointed with quiet strength. Below it, a single phrase in block letters, "Respect the roots." A week later, the land that had nearly been lost was quiet again. No backhoes, no flags staked for concrete, just rows of green returning to soil that had been protected, not by lawyers, but by truth. The developers had withdrawn, citing community pressure and unexpected public backlash, but in reality, they were buried under a nation's conscience, freshly awakened by one man's voice. And Emmett Rowe? He didn't go on a media tour. He didn't sign book deals. He didn't cash in. He did what he always did. Woke up before dawn, fed the chickens, and watched the sun rise over a field that no longer felt threatened. Yet things had changed. A young woman from the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Ethics Department arrived to interview him. Her name was Kayla Monroe, a first-generation college student from the same county. "I just want to know," she asked, recording him with a handheld mic, "how did you stay so calm when she mocked you?" Emmett looked off toward the fence line for a moment before answering. "Because being mocked ain't the same as being wrong," he said, "and I knew what I came there to protect." She clicked the recorder off. That might be the most important sentence I've ever heard. Elsewhere, Judge Clarissa Hightower stood on the stage of a rural law symposium, delivering a speech titled, "How One Courtroom Taught Me to Listen." She didn't shy from the moment. She owned it, told the story without softening her part in it. Accent is not a measure of intelligence, she said to the crowd of young law students. It's often the sound of experience, the sound of survival, and in one courtroom it was the sound of justice. The clip went viral too, and outside the courthouse a newly installed plaque was embedded in the garden beside the flagpole. Donated anonymously, though everyone knew who inspired it. It read, "This land wasn't saved by power, it was saved by a voice that never needed to shout." People visited it, some just to stand, some to touch the soil around it. Because in a country where voices like Emmett's were too often dismissed, one man reminded everyone, the roots are where the strength is. 1 year later, Bryan County looked the same on the surface. Same roads, same silos, same feed store. But something had changed beneath the skin of the town. People listened differently. At the courthouse, a new tradition had taken hold. Once a month, the court hosted Community Voice Day, an open session where residents could speak uninterrupted about what mattered to them. No suits, no gavels, just stories. The idea? Judge Hightowers. She had not only earned back respect, she had grown into something new, a leader who learned. One who no longer confused quiet voices with small ones. And Emmett? He never ran for office, despite the town begging. But he did agree to one thing, teaching a class at the local high school, agriculture and American civics. His students listened more than they talked, because they knew the man in front of them wasn't giving a lesson. He was giving a legacy. One morning a student asked him, "Do you ever wish you'd spoken differently that day?" Emmett looked up from the attendance sheet, chuckled. "I reckon if I had, you wouldn't be asking me that question." He paused. "I don't regret how I talk. I regret how long folks had to wait for someone like me to be heard." The student raised his hand again. "What was the hardest part?" Emmett smiled, but his voice came quieter now, believing it would matter. That afternoon, another message arrived at Emmett's farm, this one from a congressional ethics panel, inviting him to testify on the importance of rural representation in federal policy discussions. It was signed by 5 lawmakers. Attached to it, a handwritten note from a clerk. "We watched the video, we cried, and we finally listened. Thank you for teaching us what dignity sounds like." That night, Emmett stood outside as the sun dipped behind the hills. He could hear the crickets starting, the hum of the earth getting ready to rest, and in the distance, church bells rang from town square, same bells that tolled after war, after drought, after flood. Tonight, they rang for something else. A courtroom turned humble, a farmer turned symbol, a voice turned anthem. He tipped his hat to the darkening sky. And the words he'd said a year ago, spoken slow, thick and true, were now etched not just in memory, but in the conscience of a country.